Hello, my friends. It is Monday, December 1st, 2025, and a lot is going on. Yesterday, there was a big diplomatic push in Florida, where Secretary Rubio was leading the charge there. They spoke for something like 6 hours, and they didn't really get very far. But then today, we see the Europeans really coming out and slamming Putin, saying, like, when's he going to agree to something? He says no, he says no, he says no, or the Russians can't be trusted, or variations of this. I'll show you that in just a moment. Let's start here. Following the U.S.-Ukraine talks in Florida, there's reportedly no progress on territorial concessions, ABC News reports. Russia refuses to discuss a ceasefire along the front line. They just keep saying no. We have to address the ultimate issues, and then we have peace, instead of having the ceasefire where the Ukrainians are just going to take advantage of us, as if the Russians aren't going to use that same time. While Ukraine stands firm against giving up territory, why does only Ukraine have to give up territory? Why wouldn't Russia, who's the aggressor, need to give up territory if you're going to have a just peace? But that's assuming a just peace. So there's no breakthroughs that were achieved. Trump's peace proposal reportedly includes a Ukrainian withdrawal from the entire Donetsk region, which Kyiv rejects. So they're not really getting very far here. Let's look at this. U.S. negotiators are exploring, this is in the Kyiv Post, U.S. negotiators are exploring ways to sidestep Ukraine's constitutional limits, from NATO membership to territorial clauses, to craft compromises that do not require Kyiv to abandon its positions. So Kyiv can maintain, hey, we're going to hold on to our territorial integrity, but somehow, or whatever the issue is, or our option to join NATO or whatever, but something else might preclude it, not this agreement. That's what they're trying to get to. So here it is in the Kyiv Post. Let's look at the NATO one. One of the most contentious points in the original 28-point U.S. proposal, which is not a U.S. proposal, is really a Russian proposal, where Trump just said, yeah, sure, that's ours, and let's put that forward, was the requirement that that Ukraine formally renounce its constitutionally enshrined aspiration to join NATO, a key Russian demand and a red line for Kyiv. So Russia's demanding you must, Kyiv saying, no, we won't. So they're kind of deadlocked. However, negotiators have now discussed an arrangement under which Ukraine would not be required to legally abandon that aspiration. They still can say, we still are wanting to push to it, but they can work some other agreements somewhere else that preclude it in practice, even if they don't have to deny it. The Ukrainians don't have to deny it. Ukraine will not be pushed to officially, in the legal sense, reject this aspiration, a CNN source said. Instead, Ukraine would be effectively barred from joining the alliance through agreements made without Kyiv's formal participation. That's bilateral agreements between the United States and Russia, or something else, either in bilateral talks or multilateral assurances between NATO and Moscow. So I think this is a foolhardy thing to be pursuing. I think if you just outlast the Trump administration, the next administration may very well have a different stance on Ukraine joining NATO. And don't you want Ukraine in NATO, and not perhaps leaning toward the Ruski mirror, but be solidly with the Europeans? Okay, at any rate, so that was yesterday, 6 hours worth of trying to work through some things that didn't get very far. Right now, this was today, Witkoff was holding additional talks with Rustem Umerov, as there still are some issues that need to be addressed. Nothing probably will come out of that, but he was supposed to be flying to see Putin. He'll be doing that tomorrow. Now, this was really interesting. If Axios is correct, and Trump has committed to treating an attack on Ukraine as an attack on NATO, so one of the ways of trying to work this out, you have to have security guarantees. So if you write it in such a way that an attack on a further attack by Putin on Ukraine has essentially the same impact as an attack on NATO, that would be a way of having the NATO guarantees without having NATO guarantees. But it's also functionally indistinguishable from letting Ukraine into NATO, which the draft rules out. So we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. This is early reporting, so just take that with a grain of salt. Michael McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, says skeptics argue that Putin will never accept Ukraine's joining NATO. But Ukraine and NATO members do not need to ask Putin's permission. That's right. What gives Putin the right to have a veto over this? Putin has no place in negotiations between Ukraine and the alliance. Allowing him to disrupt or put off these deliberations would be a sign of American weakness, not only to Moscow, but also to Beijing. I think that's very fair. And he goes on, if Ukraine is a member of NATO, Brussels will never allow Kyiv to launch a war of unification in the future. So Putin should actually rest easier knowing that nothing's going to happen from that end, because NATO, the alliance, is going to say, no, 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 don't do that. We're not doing that. Okay, but if Russia still insists that Ukraine's joining the alliance threatens Russia, and they will, Trump can explain to Putin that NATO membership will constrain Ukraine. Zelensky, of course, will never formally recognize the Russian annexation of occupied Ukrainian territory, yet the possibility of NATO membership could lead him to agree to a formula in which Kyiv accepts that it will seek the reunification of Ukraine only through peaceful means. West Germany and South Korea agreed to similar terms in return for defense treaties with NATO and the United States. So that could be the way that things ultimately go. Now, there was this interesting study. Abandoning Ukraine would cost Europe 1.4 to 1.8 trillion. But Kyiv's victory would be, if you just paid for it now and put the money up front, Kyiv's victory would be estimated at 606 to 972 billion, roughly half the price according to a Norwegian study. The Kremlin win would shift Russia's pressure toward the Baltics, demanding a massive NATO buildup. So if you just if you just pay the money, it'll be much cheaper than if you allow the Kremlin to win. Okay, so here's the 606 to 972 and the 1.4 to 1.8 trillion. The report directly states that in the event of a Russian victory, millions of Ukrainian refugees would flood into Europe, increasing pressure on EU state budgets, shift its focus to the Arctic or to the Baltic, and that all is very possible. Europe's choice is simple: either support Ukraine now or pay twice as much later and lose strategic balance. In the event of permanent conflict or Russian victory, Ukraine will incur a permanent need for support, while in the event of a Ukrainian military victory, Western support will be much reduced over time. I think that's very fair. And by the way, I mean, it's the same logic as why you buy a home security system. And while we're at that, today is Cyber Monday. I'm not making anything off this, but if you're looking for like Christmas kind of specials, savings, like you can get your home security and other things online today. But like my greater point was this: you pay for something like a home security system, not because you like paying for the home security system, but because you like that better than you like the cost of the much costlier scenario of a break-in. Okay. Garry Kasparov said, as leaders once understood, it was explained clearly by Harry Truman, you fight small wars to avoid fighting big ones. If you think supporting Ukraine winning is expensive, it's nothing compared to the cost of Ukraine losing. We have to keep that in mind as we're talking about these negotiations. Meanwhile, NATO just tested defending Europe without the U.S. in Romania's Carpathians. So it's really interesting. The U.S. seems determined to pull out of most of its NATO obligations and focus itself elsewhere. Maybe it's Venezuela, maybe it's talking about China and Taiwan still, but not being so involved in Europe. French troops took 10 days to arrive through 5 planes, 11 trains, 15 convoys, while Americans still ran airspace control and intel. So they're practicing for a day without America being involved in NATO or being the clear leader of NATO. Okay, now the headline here was what was happening where European leaders slamming Putin. Macron welcomed Zelensky in Paris. And then Zelensky said French support holds special significance for Ukraine. I'm grateful to President Emmanuel Macron and his team. What is needed now is something that will truly change the course of the war, lead to a just peace, a real conclusion, and we greatly value the strength of our relations and France's leadership. And Macron has been a strong leader in this process. Macron's speech was freaking brilliant. Listen to this. They, the U.S., first called for a ceasefire. March of this year, President Zelensky said yes. I agree with the ceasefire. They went over. Russia said no. That's the first time. Then another proposal came through in June. We worked on it here in London. Russia said no. A second time. Then there was Anchorage, an American proposal for mediation. Russia said no. A third time. America's coming forward with yet another proposal to mediate. We now need to wait for Russia's response. Are they willing to put an end to the fighting or not? They're going to say no. I mean, you know they're going to say no. So we're very worried about what might happen, but the Russians are going to continue to say no. And then we see this. French President Macron is going to visit Beijing on Wednesday. He's going to be urging Xi Jinping to again, pressure Russia into agreeing to a ceasefire. I don't think anything will come of that either. She has very little reason to want to do that. Now, you saw the president, people are worried about the new president of Poland. But he was coming out pretty strongly here. There were no agreements with the Muscovites in the 19th, 20th, or 21st century. Only lies, a desire to take lives and to destroy. Remember, Poland remembers the experience of being under Soviet control. This was said by Polish President Karol Nawrocki. He stressed that history offers a lesson for modern Poland. Deals with Russia have never been real. Let me repeat that. Deals with Russia have never been real. And it's a truth everyone must learn. Wow. Okay. I mean, that's good to hear him articulate, because everybody's worried that he's going to, go soft on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Okay. And then we have finally Kaya Kallas, and she was just asked a question, and here's her perspective. Let's listen to this.
We don't think it's right to go into, sovereign countries' decisions, how big is their army. But my point was that if there's going to be a pressure on Ukraine's army that hasn't invaded anybody, then there should also be pressure on Russian army. And really, the Russian army is the one that is actually a risk to everybody. And I'm not.
Now, that's part of the 28-point plan. Why are we talking about putting pressure on the Ukrainians by reducing the size of their army and not talking about the Russians doing that? The Russians are the threat to the neighborhood.
Talking about European countries, but all the neighboring countries of Russia. If you look at those 19 countries that they have invaded in last 100 years, I mean, they're all at risk. If Russia's army is big, if their military budget is as big as it is right now, they will want to use it again. Thank you.
Yeah. That's right. So European leaders seem pretty united that Putin's the problem. Putin's saying no. Putin's agreements are not worth the paper they're printed on. Putin's army's too big, and that could become a problem later on down the line. All right, last little bit. This is by Darth Putin. Darth Putin said, I tell Trump my peace terms. Trump tells Witkoff what they are, and then Witkoff tells me Trump's terms that I told him. Then I say they aren't enough. So we both blame Ukraine for me not accepting my own terms, and I keep attacking them. Rinse and repeat. That's exactly right. That's exactly what's been happening. Okay, my friends, that's all that I have. Tell me what you think about this in the comments below. Thank you for the time, the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person who cares about Ukraine.